next up is a dynamic panel on the future of cloud. I'm going to introduce Manju Ramanathan, who's the Senior Director of our Compute Products. He will introduce all of the panels. And then after the panels, we'll have a short closing remarks and get going with happy hour. So without further ado, Manju.
Hey, everyone. Cool. Thank you very much for making time. This is the last panel discussion. So I understand I'm the one who's standing between you guys and beer, right? But we'll make it fun. I'm really honored to have such an esteemed panel here. The intent is really, really simple. We just have one goal. We want to figure out the future of cloud in about 20 minutes. We want to nail it down. That's it, right? So simple objective. So let me introduce my esteemed panel members. Mike Roberts, I'll start from you. Mike is the co-founder of Symphonia. Symphonia is a serverless cloud expert and a cloud consulting firm based in New York. Thank you very much, Mike, for making time. And Ariel Jatib. Ariel is a co-founder of StackPoint Cloud. Some of you who are in the CNCF world, Kubernetes world, must have run into him. They provide a managed Kubernetes service and a single pane of glass visibility for distributed Kubernetes deployment across multiple clouds. And StackPoint also runs their managed Kubernetes cloud on top of DigitalOcean. Right. And this gentleman probably doesn't require much of an introduction. Dan Cohn is the executive director of CNCF. I'm really honored that you could make it, and I'm glad that I could share this podium with all three of you. So with that in mind, let me start off with like a really basic question. Dan, can you tell me what was the first cloud deployment that you did, just to break the ice, and what was your experience like when you deployed the?
Sure. So a very stretch for a definition of cloud, but when I was in college back in 1994, I set up the first music store on the web that conducted the first secure commercial transaction. And so the cloud at the time for me was several servers underneath the desk. But it was a little crazy reach from back then when you could literally know every website in existence to today and the $5 droplet and all that. So that was 94.
Whoa, okay. All right. Ariel?
Yeah, so like Dan, I come from the shared hosting world. But the first time I remember spinning up an on-demand server in the cloud VM was actually DigitalOcean, and I think I wanted to play around with some blog platform, and the click deploy was really appealing, and yeah,
cool.
Great experience.
It was really simple, right?
Super easy.
Mike?
I'm kind of a laggard, actually, which is surprising considering some of the stuff we'll probably talk about in a bit. It was only 4 years ago the first time I used public cloud, because I've been in finance for a decade, and there's the kind of companies that like keeping their servers close to hand. So yes, about 4 years ago, I was working on part of a data engineering team and spinning up an EMR cluster to do some data engineering on AWS.
Cool, cool. So the way I'm thinking of structuring this conversation is kind of like a threefold, right? Let's spend a little bit of time talking about what are some of the true challenges that you guys see in today's world from a cloud point of view. What are some of the core developer-facing challenges that exist in today's world? And then I'd like to pivot the conversation into like what are some of the key trends that you are seeing in the cloud space. Does it solve some of the the challenges that we will discuss, or are there any key trends that are like totally disruptive that we should all be paying attention to, right? And then I want to, DigitalOcean is a very open source friendly company. I'm personally passionate about understanding what is the role of open source as we shape the future of cloud. But outside of that, I'm also just super interested in just hearing like one or two. If you were to pick like one or two, I know what you would likely say, Dan, but one or two like key open source initiatives that are happening that we as a developer should be absolutely aware of, right? So that's kind of how I am thinking, how we use the rest of the 15 minutes. So going to Dan, if I may ask you a question, what would be like, one big challenge or one or two big challenge that exists today for a developer to consume cloud platforms?
Sure.
Right.
So I run the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and we define cloud native as having three big components: containerization, microservices, and orchestration.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of companies that I talk to have some huge monolithic application often running on bare metal, and it's just they just can't figure out how to even get started. And cloud native, the idea of doing a rewrite seems impossible, and very likely is impossible. It has a terrible track record. And so I'd say sort of one of the key innovations or insights that I've seen is the idea that although people, ideally, containers are these very small things that each one has its own microservice and can evolve independently. In fact, anything that can run on a computer can run in a container. And my favorite example of this is Ticketmaster, which has some 40-year-old PDP-11 code running on an emulator in a container in the cloud. And so the idea that you can actually lift and shift, as it's called, your old monolithic applications, containerize them, and then the key next step is, and the key value is if you can move to a CI/CD system where you can redeploy it as new upgrades and libraries and things for like Spectre and Meltdown, other issues come out. And then when you start needing to make changes to it, instead of just continuing to work on that monolith, now you can try and chip away at it and make separate applications that speak via an API. And so I think that there is a path from the status quo to cloud native that's actually much less disruptive than a lot of companies realize.
So this is actually a super important question. It came up in the morning sessions that we had. What could we do as a cloud provider to facilitate this migration of applications, so to say? What is lacking? Are the tools missing? Are the documentation missing? Everything?
Yeah, I think part of it is just that a lot of customers sort of see the story, or they see these small startups who just say, like Uber claim, I believe them, but that they have 4,000 microservices for their 1,200 engineers. Right. And so I think sometimes the DigitalOcean marketing or CNCF marketing can talk about the sort of vision of microservices and such, but trying to talk about an on-ramp, right, I think is helpful for a lot of existing companies.
Cool, okay, thank you. Ariel, what do you think is like one major challenge from your perspective?
Yeah, I think like Dan says, especially kind of legacy enterprises figuring out a strategy for how to get from monoliths or on-prem to multi-cloud hybrid environments and kind of play around with the tooling that is an ecosystem quickly evolving is some of the challenges that we see both from customers, and we also organize a bunch of Kubernetes meetups, and so also out there kind of in the broader community.
Can I just make a quick pitch for that? Ariel actually started the New York City meetup, which is one of the biggest, longest going, back in August of 2015 here at DigitalOcean. Yeah. So thank you to both of you for all the work along the way.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I do encourage folks to sign up for that. It's a really great monthly activity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Mike, what would be one big problem that we have today?
To me, one of the biggest problems is the exponential explosion of tools and languages and platforms and everything. One of the great jobs that the CNCF does is they put together this landscape of everything that's happening in cloud native world. One of the terrible things that the CNCF does is they put together this landscape that tells you everything that's going on in cloud native world. Because you look at it, if you're not an expert in this stuff, and it's just, where do I start? And it's not just where do I start, but like so many companies have embraced the idea of you build it, you run it teams and autonomy, which is wonderful. except that you then see this Cambrian explosion of tools and languages and techniques in companies as well, and they never quite figure out how to sort of manage that, some of them. And so there's sort of two problems with that. One is, after a while, it can become impossible for an engineer in one of these companies that's maybe 10, 15 years old to be able to do their jobs effectively because they need to know so much stuff. And that's just hard. But the other problem, which I think is almost as important, but which doesn't get talked about as much, is that some of these things are genuinely life-changing from an organizational point of view. And there is an opportunity cost to not actually understanding what availabilities there are out there. And so how do you A, keep what you've chosen to use under control, and B, sort of be still understanding enough that there are things out there in the world that could make an order of magnitude difference to how you do things.
Right.
I was able to see the talk from the Dropbox engineer just before us, and it reminded me of the analogy of operators for long distance back 100 years ago, where you needed a switchboard to connect things together, and they looked at the growth rates of telephone adoption and how many telephone calls we're making and how many calls each operator could connect, and projecting it forward showed that more than the entire population of the US would need to be employed as a telephone operator just to connect all the calls that people were going to make. And of course, the solution was that they automated that piece of it. And the same thing for Dropbox, where they could never have scaled to the level that they have if they had not just adopted automation to that degree. Just one other point. I appreciate the mention for the landscape. I will mention that at times it's been called the hellscape, but for folks that haven't seen it, you can get it at l.cncf.io, and it just pops up on your mobile phone if you want to take a look. But in particular, we just launched an add-on to that, which is the landscape you can think of as the back side of a piece of paper. The front side we call the cloud-native trail map. And it's trying to say, hey, if you choose CNCF technologies, you want to start with containerization and then CI/CD and then look at Kubernetes for orchestration, and tries to take you through it, but without saying this is the only way you can do it. But I do appreciate the shout out, even with, there's no negative press, as they say. So l.cncf.io.
To piggyback on it, yes, I think what's exciting about the explosion of microservices and the idea of CD is that it's paired with behavioral kind of approaches. Digital transformation often goes hand in hand. And so you're starting to see large organizations like Google have a services wing, which kind of helps drive change around process. And then there's the technology that comes in and facilitates these things. Other approaches that I've seen be really effective, I'll use Squarespace as an example. Early adopter of Kubernetes on-prem, definitely using, they built their own service mesh, and now as Istio is kind of gaining traction, then they're starting to look to adopt that. And so I think that's what we're seeing, is that sometimes you always kind of be, and to harken back to the Dropbox talk, you kind of always have to be migrating, and some of these companies have kind of built their own tools to suit their needs, and as tooling from the community kind of gathers steam and adoption, they see great value in migrating to these solutions to address their problems.
We have a name for that. Instead of the NIH syndrome of not invented here, we call it NIY, not invented yet. Another one is Spotify here in New York, where they have their own container orchestration system that works for them, has scaled to this point, and now they're looking at how to migrate over to Kubernetes.
That's interesting. You know, when we kicked off this conversation, our CEO, Ben Uretsky, talked about the emphasis on simplicity. We tend to put a lot of constraints on ourselves. As a product manager, I'm always torn between, do I build more products because this customer wants this customer wants that. You know, like there's different flavors of products that we want to build. Along the lines of proliferation of the tools, what is the proliferation of the products happening as well? You know, what's the challenge there from a customer's perspective, like, oh, do I use this product to solve my problem? Do I use that product? You know, how do they navigate, right? You know,
it's really tricky, and I think that a lot of people that I talk to, especially with the larger vendors like Amazon and Google and Microsoft, they do pretty much everything alone, right? And so what a lot of customers will do is focus on one vendor and exploit as much as they can with one vendor, because at least they're then limiting their choices to 1/3 of what they owe, or a quarter of what's possible. And I think the great thing is, certainly with the big vendors, because they all have so many capabilities, that is actually a perfectly legitimate strategy. And sometimes I think that people can get too worried about being cloud neutral, when actually if they exploit as much as they can from one vendor, that's actually going to help them go faster. And that's very context dependent.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to piggyback on that a little bit and say, when we think about the future of cloud, and I'll use Kubernetes and federation and all the great efforts around conformance and portability of workloads, that I think that's what it's going to enable for companies, is to make decisions about where the workload is best suited to, or the compute best suits the workload, and then have a more fluid way of managing those across, we'll call them multi-cloud, is one of the ways we call it now, but ultimately you'll be looking at it as just a cloud, right? I have infrastructure, and certain workloads run on AWS because it's AI, and I need GPUs, and sometimes I'll use DigitalOcean, but I think that is, again, part of the exciting aspect of where we're headed with all this stuff.
Right. Yeah, that's the challenge too, right? From a product perspective, you can accomplish what you want to accomplish with multiple products. Do you want to throw in like like GPU, or are you just okay with like multiple cores, right? Yeah, it seems like this is a conundrum we have right now.
So one of the things we do as a company to kind of address this, how do I try a tool or some software, is that we make it really easy for you to deploy Kubernetes clusters and cloud native tooling at the provider of your choice. And I think we are still very much, to Dan's point, kind of this is growing. And so one of our goals as an organization is not only to educate you about what's available to address the problems that you have, and hopefully you bring some context to it, but we're also making it really easy for you to go and try these things and hopefully see if it is the right solution for you.
Yeah. I want to take like, the clock stopped working. Maybe future is, there is no future perhaps. Our future is stalled. So it says I have 15 minutes. It's been saying that for a while. So.
2 minutes.
Wow.
Okay. All right. So.
Okay.
2 minutes. Wow.
Otherwise, we'll be here all night. Yeah.
I know. Well, let's talk about a little bit of like the key trends that you're seeing in the cloud space. And then if you can actually connect the dots with open source also, that's even better, right? Dan, would you like to?
Sure. So I'll go ahead and do my version of plastics, which is to say service mesh. And I do want to emphasize that, I don't know if any of you have seen Graduate, that you actually get the plastics reference, but I do want to emphasize no one should start with a service mesh. Start with containerization, then CI/CD, then orchestration. But as you get a working cluster up and running, what you find is that there's a whole set of services that would be amazing to centralize, although it still remains distributed, where you could do things like canary rollouts of just having 1% of your traffic go to a new version of your site, or blue-green deployments, and giving you a ton more observability into the traffic that's moving around, a lot of policy. It gives you a lot of security capabilities. And so CNCF has two really competing projects within that space. One is called Envoy, and it came out of Lyft originally, and the other one is called Linkerd. And both of them are extremely well regarded, used in production today by very, very substantial sites like Lyft, like Monzo Bank for Linkerd, that's going to be keynoting at our event in Copenhagen next week. And then I will just mention a project coming down the pike that folks are very excited about called Istio that Ariel mentioned before. It sits on top of the service mesh, and it can provide more of what previously would have taken a human to move things around and apply judgment and adjust and such. And so I think there's just a ton of promise there.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Big +1 on that. Super excited about service mesh.
I'm biased, but I think that, that
all this container stuff is pointless. Nobody needs to use it. They should just do serverless.
Serverless.
100% of their applications. I hate boring panels where everyone just agrees.
Apparently, Dan's going to speak for me. So I'm a big fan of serverless. I'm a big fan of hybrid architectures between serverless and containers. But I do think that a lot of what I'm seeing is teams approaching serverless. And there's an important thing to remember about serverless that isn't obvious at first. So there's one part of serverless which is functions as a service. So AWS Lambda, Google Cloud Functions, Fission if you're on CNCF world. And that's really important, and that's very, very valuable. And that's where a lot of the hype has come from serverless, is this is a new kind of compute platform. How do we run our applications without having to worry about all of the container stuff? We just want to write our code and let the vendor or the platform figure it out. And that's extremely important, and it's very valuable. But it's actually the boring part of serverless. The much more interesting part of serverless is, what if I don't have to write any code at all? Or what if I don't have to run any applications, or don't have to run certain applications at all anymore? And that's the other half of serverless. So it's things like Auth0 providing user management. It's things like Google Firebase providing databases that mobile developers can use and never actually need an SRE team. It's all kinds of other things. It's AI services from Amazon. And these are the far, far more interesting things, because the less code that I have to write and the less applications that I have to manage, then the faster that I can go. And for companies that are trying to optimize for time to market, this is extremely important. And so to me, yes, I love using AWS Lambda, don't get me wrong, but the less Lambda code that I can write and the more other products that I can use that somebody else is up all night on call for, the better. Which of course brings up the question, where does this fit with open source? And I'm going to give something of a hot take here, which is, if I'm using a bunch of vendor services, on the whole, I don't necessarily care whether they are open source or not. What I care about is whether I can use them, how expensive they are, and whatever. Now, once those things start stabilizing, and once we start seeing commoditization of some of those services, that's where open source is super important to me, because then you see proliferation of products across platforms, and then I can much more easily migrate. But if I'm optimizing for time to market, I care about what products are available and how little I have to code.
I have so many questions, but we're out of time. Well, let's definitely continue this conversation after the session, but thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time. Thanks all.
Thanks for having us.